Past several weeks we've been studying true spirituality. We're going to continue in that study this morning. We're going to read a couple of passages of Scripture out of the book of Romans and out of Luke chapter. We also may live for a new life. If we have been united with him like this in his death, we shall certainly also be united with him in his resurrection. We know that our old self is crucified with him so that the body of the sin might be done away with it. We did a little bit of look at that last week, but this is the Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain. Luke 9, verses 28 and 31. It says, about 8 days after this, Jesus said this. He took Peter and John and James with him and went up on the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearances of his face changed. His clothes became as bright as the flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared of glorious splendor, talked with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which is about to become fulfillment in Jerusalem. And then down to verses 34 and 36. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped him. They were afraid, and they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I am chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at the time what they had seen. Now, this morning, we talked the last couple of weeks about we talked about the need to die to self and to die to self-desires and the fact to reject self in that sense. We talked about those issues last week. We're talking today more about the resurrection. Focused a bit about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What we're going to be focusing on as we go down through this is telling us not only was Christ been resurrected, that we will be resurrected. And our study today is around how we should help us understand that we are to be, we are to live like as we've been resurrected in Jesus Christ. In order to love God, to live for God, and fulfill what God calls us to do as we become His believers. But the most important part of all this, including as we look at this whole process of death, death of Christ would not have really could not have really meant that much had He not been resurrected from the grave. And so we look at it, and we want to take that example of our own selves, our death to self, our living for God, takes on a whole new meaning, and takes on great meaning, the fact that it says that as Christ was raised, that we too shall live again, we shall be resurrected. That's a great hope for the future. But it has more to say also about today than it does about the future. We should live our lives, I said already, as if we're already dead and dead to ourselves and dead to our sin, and been raised in Jesus. That's the resurrection we're talking about here now. We look at this whole process. So we're going to bring in the transfiguration because what we want to look at as we looked at for just a very few minutes. It emphasizes some very things that we're going to emphasize about the resurrection. We find on a certain day, at a certain time, for example, we find that the disciples and Jesus went up a mountain, and on that certain day and time, the transfiguration took place. It talks about his countenance changing, his clothes like a flash of lightning, brighter than the sun, you might put it that way. And at a certain time, they came down the mountain. And for many thousands of years, perhaps more so today than any other time, people look at the resurrection of Jesus Christ or the ascension of Jesus Christ, and those inside the church, and some of those in the church, place that in almost a level we call mythology. It's a story, it didn't really happen, but the truth of the matter is, Paul said later on in his writings, if Christ has not been raised from the grave, then we're not going to be raised from the grave. We're the hopeless of all men. But because he's been raised, we shall be raised. So that's an important crux that we stand on as a believer. The resurrection is a historical fact that took place in space and time. And the ascension we look at here is a historical fact that took place in space and time, written into the text of Luke. We find where it says we disciples on the Emmaus Road. That's they're walking with him, and they don't recognize him at first. It's only after he begins to talk about some of the things that deals with his ministry and his past ministry. And he says to them, ought not Christ have suffered for these things and enter into his glory? So he asks that as what? A certain hour and a certain time, a certain space as they're walking the road to Emmaus. It's only after it looks like he's going to walk on and disappears from them that they begin to realize it's the resurrected Jesus Christ. So I say that all to say because of the Christian faith itself stands or falls on the resurrection. We have ample history that Roman documental history that a man named Christ did die, died at the hands of Pilate, was crucified. That means absolutely nothing unless he's resurrected. He's just like any other man if he was not resurrected in the tomb. That also says something else. It says that God took his sacrifice on that cross, my sins and your sins, and God said that I accept this price to be paid. And can be forgiven through the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. If God had not accepted the death of Jesus Christ on my behalf, on behalf of all the rest of the world out there, Christ remained in that tomb, and that's where they would have found him the next day. And they went to visit the tomb, and it says to put spices on his buried body. They'd have found his body there, and they put spices on it. So it's important. The resurrection is extremely important. As I said, the Christian faith rises or falls on that. And so that's why it's an extremely important thing that we look at here. So he asked this question of those disciples on the road to Emmaus. Again, it's a certain time, a certain time of the day, it's a certain space. They're walking down the road. It's not some kind of mythology. He had many more appearances after that. At one particular text, when he appeared to disciples, talks about appearing to over 500 at one time. So it's quite documented that he actually did that. And so it's not something we want to kind of put off in the area of what I call mythology or some altered dimension, if you want to put it that way. No, we must stand or fall on this resurrection. So it also says it says at one point in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, whom he also showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of 40 days. He says to them, put your hands on my side, you touch on my wrist. And at one point he even asked for food. And he talked about here, also ascended into heaven, there on the Mount of Ascension. So the disciples didn't speak of that right away, that it happened. That later on they kept to himself, but later on they do talk about it. So we find another time in the book of Acts, also in Acts chapter 9, verse 3 and 9, Paul on Damascus Road. He encounters the resurrected Lord there on the Damascus Road. Paul is going to Damascus to basically persecute these young Christians, and he encounters Jesus Christ. Christ basically asks him, why is he persecuting him? Why is he persecuting the church? In that encounter, it says that there's such a blinding light when Christ appears that Paul is temporarily blinded until he is relieved of that blindness by later on in the book of Acts. So we find there's again a space and time there on the Damascus Road. We also find that he talks to us in time there on the history of man more than one time, but here it is. And he speaks to Paul, and Paul, of course, is convinced that this is indeed the Messiah. And he goes from being a persecutor of the church to one who's now preaching the truth about Jesus Christ. But we'll also find there'll be a final time when Christ is going to reappear and break into the history of mankind. That's recorded over in the book of Revelations, where he returns. We call the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's a real historical time. It's going to be in an actual event in a specific place. Specific people saw, heard, touched this body. We have quite a lot of proof about not only the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we look at this. So I'm looking at this here in our Bible study. It says these four things: the death, resurrection, ascension, later appearance of Jesus Christ brings up, put forth two basic truths, and I kind of touched on them a while ago. First basic truth is that it's clear proof of historic resurrection of Jesus Christ. All these people who saw, talked with, on some occasion ate with, but that's number one. And number two, that resurrection I pointed to is the proof that God accepted the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It's the absolute proof that His work on the cross was completed and done, and God the Father accepted that. So the physical resurrection of Christ is something for us today, because what it means is that one day we're going to be resurrected. He's going to return, but it means something beyond that. As I read to you earlier, Paul says we are to live today as if we're already dead to sin and alive in Christ. One sense you might say we're already gone to heaven, in the presence of God, returned here, and live that way. As Paul lived that way. And to live a way that says we obey God, we love God, and we follow His commands. So the writer also brings out 5 things here, 5 truths about it. It says, first, Christ died in history. So that's the point we've been making, a particular space, time, and that was the history. Secondly, Christ arose in history. And I already talked about how important it was. Raised as He was raised, and that's a future event that's going to come. But that's a fourth number, and that was accepted. And we said Jesus Christ will be raised one day. And these great truths are what we want to look at for just a very few minutes. We're to practice those great truths. They mean something for us today. We're to live by faith as though we're already dead. I pointed out just a little earlier there, and practice our faith that way. Basically, in Him, we are how we're to live right now. What does that mean for us right now? I pointed out earlier, it means we're dead to sin and to sinning. And sin doesn't have a control over us anymore. We can say no and make that no stick. When I look back to my life, and perhaps if you look back on your life, or if you're this morning one who's not trusting Jesus Christ yet, we could only say no so long before sin overpowered us and we gave in to sin. But in Jesus Christ, we can say no and make that no stick. We don't have to give in unless we choose to. So the sixth one is a sixth we're going to look at right now. We live by faith now in our present history as though we had already been raised from the dead. That's what I talked about earlier. And so what does that mean in practice? We're going to live that way, live by faith already dead. Well, it means that we are to live as though we already died and been to heaven and come back again as risen. I alluded to that just earlier, just a very few minutes ago. How we're in a fellowship with God, communing with God, and we're loving God and serving God, and our will and our desires are dead. We put them to death. We maintain them to be dead, and we live in God and live for God and alive to God, and not alive for ourselves. And so. The writer of our Sunday school lesson says, so what is the Christian call on the basis of all that we just talked about? Is a calling, a moment by moment, to be dead to all things that we might live in God at that moment. So to be dead of all other things that would keep us from living for God. We are dead to those things and alive to things that help us to live for God Himself. So we talked about in the last few minutes. Then we're ready for what we call the spiritual warfare that goes on between the Christian and the world around us, and Christian and the forces of Satan around us. So where the mention was, same message, it's true, we're important in resurrection. Important is to be dead to self and alive to God. All those things are important for true Christian spirituality. That's been the focus of our lesson these last few weeks. And the goal of one of the truths I want to bring out is the spirituality rests on the resurrection of Jesus and the believer's current and future resurrection, meaning how we see lives today, alive to God but dead to self. You take these truths, you apply them, and make them a truth of your walk every day as you walk with Jesus. Thank you for tuning in. You have a God-blessed day.